Imagine it's 1st July 2015. You are a 69-year-old retired office worker living in Athens, Greece. Your name is Vassilis Argitis, and for 35 years you worked at American Express, following timetables, filing papers, trusting numbers on screens, and stamps on forms. Your apartment is modest but paid for, with a narrow balcony, a radio in the kitchen, and a table covered with medicine boxes, grocery receipts, and a small notebook where you track every euro. Your pension used to be 1,800 euros a month. Then it fell to 1,300. Even so, you kept going, because routine can make a hard life feel solid, the way a thin coat of paint can hide a cracked wall. Each week follows the same rhythm: coffee, bread, a walk to the bank, a stop at the market, then home before the heat climbs. You did everything the careful way. You worked, saved, trusted the bank, and believed that money in an account was still money. If you have ever wondered why some things suddenly become more valuable exactly when the world around them is coming apart, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened before, across countries, currencies, and generations. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then you reach the bank and see the line. It curves around the block like a question nobody wants to answer. Pensioners wait in the July sun. Some lean on canes. Some whisper rumors. Some just stare at the doors as if staring hard enough might unlock them. Inside, the money exists on paper. Outside, it might as well be on the moon. That week, many Greek pensioners without bank cards were allowed to withdraw only 120 euros. Everyone else faced daily ATM limits of 60 euros. For people who had done everything right, the message was brutal. Your savings were still yours in theory. In practice, the system had put a hand over them. That is where this story begins, because when an economy starts breaking, not everything falls at the same speed. Some assets collapse because they are promises, and promises depend on trust. Other assets rise, sometimes violently, because they are not just promises. They are claims on things people still need, still want, or still trust, when paper trust dies. Across the last 100 years, the same 5 categories keep showing up near the top of the wreckage: precious metals like gold, hard foreign currency, productive land, ownership in businesses tied to essential goods or exports, and useful tangible assets like housing, tools, vehicles, or inventory. This is not a prediction, it is an autopsy. We are looking at what history shows after confidence starts to leave a system, the way air leaks from a tire long before the rim touches the road. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. An economy is built from 2 layers. The first layer is real stuff: wheat, fuel, copper, houses, machines, skilled labor, land. The second layer is paper claims on that stuff: salaries, pensions, bank balances, bonds, insurance policies, and fixed monthly payments. Most of the time, the 2 layers move together so closely that people forget they are different. But in a crisis, the layers can split apart. When that happens, the paper layer behaves like ice in spring. It still looks solid right up until the moment it gives way. The basic mechanism is simple. When governments print too much money, or banks make too many promises, or a country borrows more foreign currency than it can ever repay, trust starts to drain out of the system. At first it is slow. Then people rush to exchange paper claims for something more real: a bar of gold, a stack of dollars, a field that grows food, shares in a company that sells oil, grain, or metal, a truck, an apartment, even boxes of parts or bags of cement. Why those things? Because they sit closer to physical reality. You cannot print more farmland with a central bank meeting. You cannot vote more gold into existence. You cannot tell a soybean exporter that dollars earned abroad are suddenly worth less just because a local politician says so. This is why collapse is rarely a single explosion. It is more like a theater where the lights are still on, the music is still playing, but someone near the back smells smoke first. The exits are narrow. The first people move quietly. The last people run. And this brings us directly to the first asset history keeps protecting when trust in money itself starts to fail. In Germany in 1923, that asset was gold. To understand why, picture Berlin not as a cartoon of wheelbarrows and chaos, but as a city of clerks, widows, shopkeepers, and veterans trying to live normal lives while the measuring stick of daily life melted in their hands. Germany had come out of the First World War burdened by debt, political instability, and reparations. The government kept spending. Tax revenue fell behind. By October 1923, tax revenues covered only about 1% of the Reich's spending. The rest was financed by printing money. At first, inflation felt survivable. Then it became a monster with no skin, just teeth. In Berlin, 1 kilogram of rye bread cost 163 marks on 3rd January 1923. By 19th November 1923, that same kilogram cost 233 billion marks. Beef went from 1,800 marks to 4.8 trillion marks. One US dollar, which averaged 47,670 marks in May 1923, reached about 4.2 trillion paper marks in November. Now look at gold. One gold mark was worth almost 1 trillion paper marks by the end of 1923. And according to historical gold pricing in marks, an ounce of gold that traded around 170 marks in January 1919 was worth about 87 trillion marks by November 1923. The number is so large it stops sounding real. But that is the point. Gold did not become magical. The currency became absurd, and this is where history gets uncomfortable. The middle class that had trusted savings accounts, salaries, and bonds was shattered. Teachers, civil servants, retired people, and small savers watched a lifetime of discipline dissolve. Wages were paid more often because waiting even a few days meant being poorer before sunset. Families ran from pay window to bakery the way sailors bail a leaking boat, not to get ahead, but to keep from sinking. Citizens sold valuables. Some banknotes were used as wallpaper because they were cheaper than wallpaper. But people who held gold, foreign currency, or real goods were in a different world. They were standing on stone while everyone else was standing on snow that had begun to melt from underneath. This does not mean every gold owner became rich. It means the unit used to measure wealth had broken. In that kind of moment, the asset that matters is the one that stays tied to reality when the local currency comes untied from it. A surprising fact many people miss is that hyperinflation does not only destroy the poor, it can destroy the careful. The reckless debtor may even get relief, because debts shrink in real terms when the money used to repay them becomes worthless. But the saver, the pensioner, the prudent clerk with cash in a bank can be ruined. In Weimar Germany, the people who had trusted the system most were often the ones it hit hardest. Look at what happened next. Once the mark lost credibility, people reached for other ways to transact. Cigarettes, goods, foreign currency, anything divisible and trusted started acting like money. That is the deeper lesson. Gold was not valuable because of fashion. It was valuable because when the official ruler snaps, people grab a ruler that still has markings on it. One more detail matters. During the early phase of inflation, many Germans still believed the state would regain control. That is almost always how these stories begin. Collapse does not walk in wearing a sign. It comes dressed as a temporary problem, a technical delay, a policy debate, a shortage of notes, a bad month. By the time people admit the measuring stick itself is broken, the repricing is already well underway. The people who kept some wealth in gold or foreign currency did not need to predict the exact date of disaster. They only needed to respect the possibility that official paper could fail. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If your bank balance appears on a screen, but you cannot transfer it, withdraw it, or spend it freely, is it really cash, or is it just a permission slip that can be revoked? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. This leads to the second part of this story. If gold protects against the death of money, hard foreign currency often protects against the death of the banking system. Argentina showed this in brutal detail in 2001 and 2002. For 10 years, the peso had been pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar. That peg felt like a promise carved in stone. But it was really paint on wet wood. Debt kept rising. Growth stalled. Confidence drained away. Then came the bank run. As former Argentine officials later described it, people realized there were not enough dollars in the system to cover all the dollar deposits. That was the moment the floor gave way. In December 2001, the government imposed the Corralito, freezing much of the banking system and sharply restricting cash withdrawals. In practice, many people could access only tiny amounts of cash each week. Informal businesses, which lived on paper money and daily turnover, were hit like fish stranded when the tide leaves. Then the peg broke. In just weeks, the currency fell from 1 peso per dollar to more than 3 pesos per dollar. Argentina defaulted on about $85 billion of sovereign debt, then the largest sovereign default in history. GDP per capita fell by around 20% during the crisis period. Unemployment rose to 25%. Poverty reached 55% of the population. Think about what that meant in everyday life. A shop owner with goods on shelves had something real. A family with physical dollars at home had a lifeboat. A saver with deposits trapped inside the system had a painting of a lifeboat, and there is an extra twist here that most people miss. After the devaluation, businesses that earned revenue in dollars or sold exportable goods suddenly stood in a much stronger position than households living on peso salaries. Argentina's later recovery was helped by a weaker peso and better export prices, especially soybeans. In other words, ownership in essential or export businesses can become another form of protection, because the cash they earn is linked to the outside world, not just the failing local one. Now here is where it gets interesting. Almost 2 decades later, Lebanon replayed parts of the same script. In October 2019, Lebanon's financial crisis became impossible to hide. Capital inflows stopped. The banking, debt, and exchange rate systems all began failing together. The World Bank later described it as a depression likely to be among the most severe globally in modern times. Real GDP had already contracted by 6.7% in 2019 and was projected to fall another 19.2% in 2020. The Lebanese lira was discounted by as much as 80% in the multiple exchange rate system that followed, but the most revealing detail was inside the banks. Around 75% of Lebanese bank accounts were denominated in dollars, yet many depositors could not withdraw actual dollars. Most banks were described as dollar insolvent, which means they owed dollar claims they could not truly honor. For the average person, that meant the screen still said dollar. The hand received something else. So a new phrase entered daily life: fresh dollars. Fresh dollars meant real physical dollars from abroad, or money outside the trapped domestic system. They could move. They could buy. They could leave the country. Old bank dollars, by contrast, behaved like photographs of money. That distinction tells you everything. When confidence breaks, hard currency outside the banking maze can suddenly outrank larger balances trapped inside it. A stack of actual notes can become more valuable than a larger number in an account because one is money and the other is a promise from a wounded institution. The winners in Argentina and Lebanon were not always the wealthy. Sometimes they were simply the people who understood one old truth. When a system starts deciding when and how you may touch your own money, liquidity becomes an asset of its own. Liquidity just means immediate access. In a crisis, immediate access is not a convenience. It is oxygen. The third asset history keeps rewarding is productive land, and beside it, useful hard goods. This sounds old-fashioned until you remember what land really is. Land is not just scenery. A good field is a machine powered by sunlight, rain, soil, and time. It turns uncertainty into calories, rent, and export revenue. When money weakens, the world often rediscovers how much that matters. In the United States during the inflationary 1970s, farmland values surged so strongly that the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago noted real farmland values had risen 42% during the previous 5 years and were more than 50% above their 1967 level. That is important. Not just nominal gains, meaning gains in inflated dollars, but real gains after accounting for inflation. Why did this happen? Because inflation does not hit all assets equally. Fixed payments get eaten, cash gets thinner. But land connected to food production can reprice upward because food remains necessary, exports remain tradable, and the land itself is scarce. It is a well in the desert, not a receipt for water. Of course, farmland later had its own painful bust in the 1980s when rates rose and debt bit hard. That matters too. Productive assets are not magic shields. They can still be overbought. They can still be buried under leverage, which means too much debt. But history shows that when inflation is the disease, assets tied to real production often move very differently from paper savings. Now place that beside the Soviet collapse. In the final years of the Soviet Union and the early years after it fell apart, money stopped functioning as a trustworthy store of value. Economists studying the period wrote plainly that in open inflation, consumers hoard durables and dollars as an alternative. They listed the most attractive stores of value in the USSR as cars, gold, housing for individuals, and inputs for firms. That sentence is one of the most revealing in all crisis history. Cars, gold, housing, inputs. Not because Soviet citizens had become irrational. The opposite. They were acting with cold logic inside a system where ruble savings could decay faster than useful objects. A refrigerator, a spare engine part, a truck tire, timber, cement, even an apartment might hold value better than cash because those things could be used, traded, or rented. They had substance. A bank book had hope. What ordinary people experienced was not just inflation, it was humiliation. Years of work, years of queuing, years of saving, and then the terrible discovery that the reward for patience was disappearance. In Russia in 1992, annual inflation exceeded 2,500%. Prices were freed, shelves changed, and money that had once represented future safety became a fading memory. This is why useful hard goods belong on our list. In stable times, a spare truck, a box of imported machine parts, or a small apartment may look boring. In unstable times, boring things can turn into bridges. They carry value across a river that cash cannot cross. This also helps explain why housing so often becomes a shelter in monetary disorder. Not always a profitable shelter, and not everywhere. But a flat or house with little debt attached is not merely an investment line. It is shelter, bargaining power, and sometimes rent income. It is an asset that can still do something, even if the local currency stops doing its job. And at this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Gold preserved measurement, hard dollars preserved mobility, land preserved productive power, housing and durable goods preserved usefulness. Each asset answered a different question that collapsing systems force on people. How do I store value? How do I pay tomorrow? How do I feed my family? How do I keep a roof? How do I hold something that does not vanish when an institution closes? Once you see the questions, the 5 assets stop looking random. They look like tools laid out on a workbench before a storm. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Weimar Germany in 1923, Argentina in 2001, Lebanon after 2019, American farmland in the inflationary 1970s, the Soviet collapse in the early 1990s. Different countries, different decades, same mechanism. When the economy starts breaking, society does not simply reward courage or intelligence. It reprices distance from fragile promises. That is the key. Gold sits far from any one government's printing press. Physical dollars sit farther from a failing local bank than digital balances trapped inside it. Productive land sits farther from paper panic than wages fixed in nominal terms. Exporters and essential businesses sit farther from local monetary decay because what they sell is anchored to global demand or real human need. Useful hard goods and housing sit farther from abstraction because they can be used, rented, bartered, or stored. In every case, what rose was not random. It was what remained credible when credibility itself became scarce. This is the secret key that unlocks the whole subject. Crises are not just about loss, they are about hierarchy. When trust is plentiful, almost all claims seem equal. A pension promise, a bank balance, a paycheck next month, a bond, a gold coin, a field, a warehouse full of copper pipe. In normal times, they all sit on the same shelf. But once doubt enters the room, the shelf tilts. And as it tilts, assets slide into a new order. First come the things that can move across borders, feed people, produce essentials, or survive without permission. Last come the things that need everyone to keep believing at once. That is why the same people are so often hurt in every collapse. The school teacher, the pensioner, the diligent saver, the small business owner whose cash sits in the wrong bank or whose prices cannot keep up. They are not stupid. They are simply closest to the paper layer and farthest from the exits. A counterintuitive fact is that the biggest gains in a breakdown often do not come from chasing exotic opportunities. They come from already owning something plain, useful, and difficult to debase. A gold coin, a cash reserve in a harder currency, a field, a workshop, a truck, shares in a business that sells what people cannot stop buying. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. And this is where history gets personal. Who gets hurt the most when the economy starts breaking? Almost always, it is the middle layer of society, not the very richest, who often own diversified assets and have access to lawyers, foreign accounts, and information, not the very poorest, who often have little financial wealth left to destroy. It is the people in between, the savers, the salaried, the pensioners, the small merchants, the people who did what every responsible society tells them to do. Look at Greece again in 2015. Retirees lined up for tiny withdrawals because they did not use debit cards and had no easy route around the system. Look at Cyprus in 2013. Deposits over 100,000 euros at Bank of Cyprus took a 47.5% haircut, meaning nearly half of those uninsured balances were converted into bank equity to recapitalize the lender. Many depositors learned the difference between money and bank money in the harshest possible way. Look at Zimbabwe in 2008. Inflation reached an estimated 79.6 billion% in mid-November, with prices doubling roughly every 24.7 hours. At that speed, wages were ice cubes on hot metal. A paycheck was not something to save, it was something to flee. People ran from currency into goods, foreign notes, fuel, food, or whatever could keep shape for another day. And look at ordinary Lebanese families after 2019. If they had salaries in lira and savings trapped inside the banks, they watched prices surge while access shrank. But households with fresh dollars from abroad, or businesses earning real foreign currency, lived in a parallel reality. Same streets, same shops, different universe. This is why ownership in essential businesses belongs on the list of assets that can explode in local value during breakdowns. When a company controls productive land, commodity reserves, export flows, energy infrastructure, or goods, people cannot stop buying. Its revenue can rise with the very forces crushing fixed-income households. In Argentina, after devaluation, exporters benefited from a cheaper peso and stronger export prices. In inflationary eras more broadly, businesses tied to oil, food, and raw materials often move with the tide that drowns paper claims. Again, that is not magic. It is plumbing. Money is the water pressure of the system. If pressure changes, the pipes carrying essential goods often reprice before the rest of the house understands what happened. The deepest cruelty of these episodes is moral as much as financial. They punish traits that are supposed to be virtues: patience, trust, obedience, thrift. The person who saved in the national currency is told he was prudent for 30 years, then foolish in 1 month. The pensioner who never speculated is pushed into a queue. The shopkeeper who kept clean books cannot get cash for inventory. The family with a fixed salary watches the grocery shelf outrun them like a train leaving the station. Meanwhile, the people who come through relatively intact tend to own things with edges. Things you can hold, sell, lease, export, or use without asking a bank manager for permission. That is the human cost hidden inside every chart. Consider one small but revealing comparison. In Cyprus in 2013, a large uninsured deposit was not cash sitting safely in a labeled drawer. It was a liability of a wounded bank. When 47.5% of deposits over €100,000 at Bank of Cyprus were converted into equity, many savers learned that the hard way. The saver became an unwilling investor at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, anyone who had kept part of their wealth outside the fragile banking system learned a very different lesson about optionality. The same split appeared in Zimbabwe, only in a more extreme form. When prices double every 24.7 hours, the calendar itself becomes an enemy. Paying workers monthly becomes meaningless. Saving for next year becomes absurd. Shops relabel goods. Commuters rush from wages into bus fare. Families buy cooking oil, sugar, fuel, soap, or hardware, not because they suddenly love inventory, but because inventory can sit still while the currency runs away. A bag of cement becomes a savings account with weight. A spare tire becomes a line of credit you can touch. And then there are businesses. In unstable periods, a grocery distributor, an exporter, a mine, a grain elevator, an oil field, or a company with pricing power can act like a bridge between the failing money world and the real goods world. Not every stock does this. Many collapse. Debt-heavy firms, luxury sellers, and businesses trapped by price controls can be ruined. But ownership in companies connected to necessities or hard currency revenues has repeatedly stood apart from households living on fixed salaries. The reason is simple. They sell what must still move even when trust breaks: food, fuel, metals, freight, utilities, and inputs. So when history asks who walks away relatively intact, the answer is almost never the people with the most paper. It is usually the people with the least dependence on any one paper promise. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. What then did the survivors usually do differently? Not perfectly, not heroically, but differently. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared 3 characteristics. First, they distrusted single points of failure. They did not keep every claim in one institution, one currency, one promise, one employer, or one political system. They understood that concentration feels efficient in calm weather and deadly in a storm. A ship with one engine can look elegant in port. It looks less elegant when the sea turns. Second, they favored assets with direct usefulness or independent pricing power. Gold did not need the local government to remain honest. Dollars held outside the trapped banking system did not need a domestic bank to reopen. Productive land did not need a finance minister's speech to keep growing crops. A truck, apartment, workshop, or stockpile of needed inputs did not need public confidence to remain useful. Shares in exporters or essential producers could reprice because the business sold into real demand. Third, they moved earlier than the crowd. This may be the most important point of all. By the time a crisis is obvious, the exits are already crowded. In Greece, once banks were shut, liquidity was rationed. In Argentina, once the Corralito arrived, freedom had already narrowed. In Lebanon, once fresh dollars became a separate class of money, the divide had already been drawn. In Weimar Germany, once the wheelbarrows appeared, the battle was over. The winners were often not people with secret intelligence. They were people who respected incentives. They noticed rising debt, rigid pegs, falling reserves, political paralysis, heavy money printing, or banking systems full of mismatched promises. They noticed when a country was trying to hold back the tide with paperwork. There is also something surprisingly modest about many historical survivors. They were not always making giant bets. Often they were simply preserving optionality. Optionality means keeping choices alive. A little gold, some hard currency, ownership of something useful, lower debt, more flexibility. One foot on solid ground, while others danced on the trapdoor. And this is where the present starts to rhyme with the past. Across many countries today, public debt is high, banking systems remain confidence machines, housing affordability is strained, and political systems still prefer easy promises to hard adjustments. That does not tell us what happens next. History is not a stopwatch, but it does remind us that fragility builds quietly. The beam rots long before the roof caves in. The historical lesson is not to panic, it is to see clearly. Now let us return to Athens, to that line outside the bank, to the pensioner in the sun, to the little notebook on the kitchen table. For people like Vassilis Argitis, the crisis was not abstract. It was 120 euros for the week. It was the fear that a lifetime of work had been placed behind glass. It was the realization that money is not just a number, it is a chain of trust, and when that chain snaps, the pieces do not fall evenly. That is the real lesson of history. When economies start breaking, the assets that explode in value are usually the ones closest to reality and farthest from permission. Gold, hard foreign cash, productive land, ownership in essential or export businesses, useful hard assets like housing, vehicles, tools, or inventory. Not because they are fashionable, because in every major breakdown, society rediscovers the same hard truth. Things with independent usefulness become more precious when promises become more doubtful. If you remember nothing else, remember this. A crisis is not just a moment of falling prices or rising prices. It is a test of what was real all along. The tide goes out, and suddenly you see which wealth was a sandcastle and which wealth was stone. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.